Perfect. All right, so we will start with the topic of current resource planning. I know we spent a lot of time already discussing integrated resource plannings and the potential need for those. This topic and discussion is more facilitated towards specific resource planning that is in Iowa legislation rulemaking procedures. Most of the expressed concerns in the written comments that there is no comprehensive assessment for the necessity for new generation, as well as the ability for the board to make thorough decisions or opportunity for discussion on the adequacy of any resource decisions. And with Mid-American and IAWC also mentioning that they have a robust planning process, Mid-American including for comment that it would provide more transparent and stakeholder engagement in its generation resource planning as a result of the resource evaluation studies that are ongoing. And for the specific discussion questions surrounding the current resource planning in Iowa, we have: what documents and analyses should the utility file to the IUB to make current resource planning more transparent? What should be the involvement of the stakeholders in the current resource planning process? And does the IUB have appropriate authority to review utilities' current resource planning process, or is a legislation and/or rulemaking change required? So with that, I will open it up for any comment.
So I'll just sum up, if that's okay. File an IRP. Allow for annual stakeholder review. There you go.
Nicholas here with Iowa Business for Clean Energy. One of the issues with regard to resource planning is that the state statute expressly permits the export of energy generated in Iowa. And so, we can look at total generation in Iowa and say, okay, well, that's nice, but how much of that is going outside the state? And I don't know that we have a very good handle on that.
Samantha.
So I think to Mr. Logier's point, I'm used to calling you board member Logier, sorry. Mr. Logier's point, I think that the annual fuel filings and maybe the IE1 would have some of that information, but I think that there is quite a bit being exported. And I think pretty much in that amount, I think has grown as more generation has been approved under advanced rate making. I think I'm a little puzzled by these questions because I don't know what the current resource planning process is. And, I think that, IPL had one, I think, that came out of its last rate case, and before that did it by virtue of serving territory in Minnesota. I believe that there's a proposal for a resource evaluation study in both advanced rate making dockets that are before the board. But as far as what the current process is, I mean, I think we've talked about there's maybe a piecemeal look at parts of what would be in an IRP in various dockets in Iowa, but absent a requirement that the utility bring us into their internal processes, then I think an IRP is what what we would need to get that transparency and get stakeholders to the table, get the board and OCA and the information they need as well. So I may be misunderstanding the premise of the question, but I don't know that there is a current resource planning process in Iowa that we can ask to be let in on.
Carrie?
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, I think part of the consideration with the export question is who, yes, we can build energy for export in Iowa, but who pays for that? So as customers of investor of utilities, how much does the utility need to build versus how much can other folks build in Iowa who also, you know, need to come for a GCU, for generating certificate before the board? You can certainly still build for export without Iowa customers having to pay for all of that, we can back up for building all that generation at the end of the day. And, you know, in terms of export or excess, you know, the FERC forms do contain that information. And in 2022, Mid-American was approaching 38% of their energy was sold to other utilities, and Alliant was at about 15. And so, yes, that gap is growing. So I think that it is important to look at, a new process that works. And then I think question 3 is really important, whether the IUB has the appropriate authority. I think that both, and we would agree that, you know, theoretically they do have the authority, but within dockets that we've had and within other proceedings and NOIs, et cetera, it's not clear that the utilities believe that the IUB has the authority to review their current resource planning, whatever that looks like. So I think that it needs to be clear to everyone that the board does have that authority.
Debbie?
Yeah, Debbie Blake with Synapse. I will echo what Samantha said about not being clear what the current resource planning process is, but in terms of what documents and analyses generally should be available to make the resource planning process more transparent. I mean, I would say really any of the fundamental inputs that go into designing the resource planning process. You know, how is the utility designing its reserve margin? What fuel cost forecasts is it using? What market price forecasts is it using? Simple things like how is it even projecting it's going to use its existing resources going forward? What new resources is it considering? All of the major inputs it's using to design its system, to evaluate its system, should be transparently available. Realizing that some things might need to be available under an NDA. I'm not saying everything has to be blasted out to every single member of the public, but it's very common to provide some of the more sensitive forecasts under NDA in a transparent resource planning process to stakeholders.
Lori?
Yeah, I also think it's important that I think the term resource planning can be super ambiguous. The last time the board exercised its general authority to ask the utilities to, well, actually it was just for Mid-American to file resource plans. The information they filed was not capacity expansion modeling, which I think is what most of the consumer groups you're hearing are mean when they say they want to see integrated resource planning. They mean they want to see quantitative capacity expansion modeling. But Sam can correct me if you're using the term in a different way. I don't put words in his mouth, but whereas you heard the back and forth earlier between me and Mr. Stevens, as you know, they said, well, Mid-American is constantly doing resource planning. And I said, okay, can we see the capacity expansion modeling you've done? He said, I never said we did that. And that feel free to correct me. I think we need clear articulation of what we mean when we're talking about resource planning, and that's the kind of thing we're thinking statutory guidance could give. But you could also just clearly state you want the utilities to be doing capacity expansion modeling, and that you want them to be doing reliability analyses that test the performance of their fleet, their entire generation fleet, during worst case weather conditions. I think another concern we've had is the utilities talk about the reliability needs of their system, but don't present the quantitative analysis to demonstrate that, and where is the right forum to be having that conversation. And we provided a pretty extensive overview in our last set of comments of what happened in the last case where the board attempted to exercise their general authority they asked for that kind of analysis and it happened. So I certainly have the question of even though I believe the board has the authority to require that kind of information, I as Carrie said very articulately, I'm not sure that the utilities agree that the board has that authority.
Yeah, I want to kind of echo what Lori said and Debbie as well, and hearing them kind of reminded, we have seen in other dockets where, well, you can't look at resource planning in this type of docket. You can't look at it here. You can't look at it there. You can only look at it over here if we ever get there. And then I think the board did try to exercise its authority in prior cases, and that information wasn't forthcoming. Whether it's advanced rate making or I think it was an SPU docket, I think, where and there was a big fight over confidential information, discovery, other things like that. I think there was litigation. I mean, it was just very difficult. And so the board has, I think, tried to exercise its authority, and I think to no avail. And so, and this echoes a lot of the points I think we made this morning too, is if the state wants this to happen, it may need to come from outside of the board, even if the board thinks it has the authority, because thus far we haven't seen, even when the board exercises that authority, that information and those processes have occurred.
I want to be clear about something. Both Sierra Club and Google and Microsoft have been referring to documents resource planning documents that we have provided, both the SPU docket as a part of our wind farm docket. And all of those documents were provided to all parties in those cases. I can't remember the exact number, but it may have been somewhere around 20 to 30 different documents that were actually provided. So the idea that we would just intentionally flout board rules or board directives, I just really have to push back against that. It may not have been exactly what Ms. Williams wanted in terms of what was provided, but that information was provided to those parties.
Yeah, I want to make sure. So it just, so on behalf of IA, what I was referring to, and I think this was, I think actually Sierra Club or the environmental interveners brought it up in another docket. I was talking about prior board orders in advanced rate making, that I wasn't talking about anything with wind prime.
But I thought I heard you refer to an SPU docket as well, a particular SPU.
I said, I think that there were some issues that happened with that docket as far as access to information, discovery, confidentiality, things like that, that made it difficult.
Incorrect, but that information was provided to all participants in that docket, as well as the wind prime docket as well. We have provided that.
I won't get into it here, but feel free to take a look at our comments. We just laid out and cited all of the board orders and the litigation that happened. I think most folks in the room are familiar with the litigation that went up to the Court of Appeals.
Any other comments at this time on any current resource planning?
I got that. Oh, yep. Yeah, this is Marcos Munoz with OCA. I think that the chapter 3554, which is the energy efficiency docket, outlines a set of requirements which in essence require a capacity expansion plan and a loading capability table with future and current supply sources, which in essence functions as a way of a form of a resource planning process. And I think that I am not certain about whether the board has authority or not to review that process, but it has to be sponsored, supported by some form of a resource planning process. And I think that's why we think that the energy efficiency docket maybe is the right venue to provide a resource planning that gets periodically reviewed.
If there are no additional comments at this time, we will move ahead. So the next topic for discussion will be energy efficiency and demand response. All stakeholders that commented on the current energy efficiency and demand response mechanism proposed changes. Those suggested changes being that the spending cap should be modified or repealed. The rate impact measure test should be replaced with the total resource cost of societal cost test. Utilities should be mandated to perform studies that determine the savings and deployment goals for energy efficiency, demand response, and distributed energy resources. Energy efficiency and demand response should be encompassed in an IRP or IDP, integrated distribution plan. And also that the utility should be incentivized to implement energy efficiency and demand response plans for the benefit of all ratepayers by providing an ROE where the energy efficiency and demand response plans result in elimination or reduction in the need for additional generation. Mr. Wright commented that Iowa Code Section 476.6 of Section 13 requires tests that overcomplicate the review of the plans and are outdated, and that that code should be rescinded and developed a jurisdiction-specific test. According to IBEC, large customers already have both the incentive and wherewithal to pursue energy efficiency measures at their plants. What they suggested change to be to opt out or self-direct EE programs for those large customers. As well, IBEC states that DRs can be a more reliable resource than company-owned generation plants, but one size does not fit all for customers. Therefore, utilities should be more flexible with the demand response offerings. Voltis has stated that MISO was concerned about the increase in the frequency of high-stress grid events that may impact system reliability. MISO cannot call upon additional demand response to mitigate these events due to prohibition on the aggregation of retail customers in several MISO states, and so they proposed to lift the ban on demand response aggregators of retail customers. And additionally, ISETA has expressed support for the incorporation of virtual net metering into energy efficiency programs, as well as improving demand response programs through virtual power plants. So if we move to the discussion questions related to energy efficiency and demand response, how would you envision the inclusion of energy efficiency demand response programs in an IRP if implemented in Iowa? Should the spending cap on EE and DR programs stay the same, increase, or be removed completely? Is there a need to replace the current RIM test? So what changes to legislation rules would be necessary to do so? Should certain customers be allowed to opt out of energy efficiency programs? And then Voltis suggests lifting the prohibition of demand response aggregators of retail customers. What do other stakeholders think about this proposal? Also, would allowing ARCs in Iowa require a legislative change? And then ISETA expressed support about virtual net metering for EE programs and virtual power plants for demand response. What do other stakeholders think about this proposal? And so with that, for these discussion questions, I will open it up for comment on energy efficiency and demand response. Ben.
Ben Flickinger for Large Energy Group. It's just going to the first two questions there. We would absolutely support the inclusion of energy efficiency and demand response as part of an IRP. We think they are big components that impact generation capacity and energy needs for the utilities and should definitely be taken into account. And we would also support the removal of the spending cap in the legislation. Generation itself is not capped at any level of spending. To the extent demand response, energy efficiency impact that, it shouldn't be a cap either.
Bob Rafferty, Iowa Business for Clean Energy, and to kind of build on what Ben's saying, and in some ways, energy efficiency and demand response should be viewed, while they're similar, separately at the same time too. I would agree taking the caps off, but most importantly for demand response, energy efficiency, energy efficiency, a customer can invest in that, right? So the fact that there's a cap on the utility won't necessarily limit investment on the energy efficiency side, but it does on demand response, because if you're going to have demand response incentives, it's the utility that has to provide those. And it's been estimated by a number of studies that you can reduce peak demand by up to 20% economically by 2030 is the projection. So we have to be thinking about how do we want to make sure we're incentivizing the utilities and they have the ability to make sure we're fully utilizing demand, the potential of demand response. Because as IBEC highlighted in their written comments, that can actually be more reliable than just generation capacity. So we really need to have a focus on that demand and making sure utilities have both incentive to implement those and the ability to implement those.
Jennifer.
Thanks. In the IPL blueprint IRP process, their consultant modeled cost-effective energy efficiency and demand response. It's routinely done. I think for an integrated resource plan to come up with a least cost outcome, you probably need to revise the cap on those programs. And I think the current RIM test is a very constraining test for energy efficiency, because it assumes that a utility will come in and ask for a rate increase to make up for all the revenues that they lose from energy efficiency, when that isn't really the case. And the RIM test tends to reward the least effective energy efficiency options. So that's why demand response does really well on the RIM test, because it doesn't actually save much energy. So revisiting the RIM constraint would be important. We've always believed that all customers benefit from energy efficiency and demand response that's cost effective, and that generally all customers should be supportive of it. It's some customers will be making investments in 1 year and participating in the programs. They might not be back to replace their furnace or whatever process they're doing for another 10 or 15 years. But their ongoing support for the programs supports other customers whose needs arise, in the next year or so. So it's important for there to be broad support for these programs that help achieve an outcome of least cost service in the state of Iowa. Okay. Oh, and Bob made a really good point on demand response. So we've been investing heavily in kind of the standard demand response. So it's large volume customers who are able to respond when a demand response event is called. And those events are fairly infrequent, and that's an important benefit. We don't diminish the value of those programs, but I don't think we should be doubling or significantly increasing spending on those when there are a lot of other untapped demand response opportunities that we're not pursuing, that we haven't spent time devoting attention to. There are demand response opportunities within the broader population of customers that we would all benefit from and that need more attention. Our settlement with Mid-American and the energy efficiency docket tease up those more innovative time of use rate and demand response options. I think part of the reason for monitoring the spend, you don't want to spend I don't know, I'm not sure it's a long-standing issue. What is the right incentive for demand response? And I wish it wasn't as contentious as it has been. And it'd be nice to come up with some way to reach some resolution. But I want to, be cautious of overspending there and save some of our resources to go towards new opportunities for all customers and make the programs more accessible to all customers. The time of use rates, we think, for utilities that install AMI meters, we really need to be more proactively engaging customers in time of use opportunities, and we're not doing a good job on that.
Aurelie?
Aurelie Windenberger with ISETA. So I think that the comments from Bob and Jennifer dovetail quite well into ISETA's proposal about virtual power plants. And in our comments that we submitted, we kind of I know last meeting there was some concern about distributed generation battery resource being more expensive than say a centralized resource, and I think there's a couple benefits of building out the distributed resource as well, even if it is a bit more expensive. One is the distributed nature of it I think leads to situations where you actually increase resiliency in outage situations. Customers that have that backup battery power are less crucial to get back online. So I think that's a benefit for the utility as they have to figure out how to get those electricity back to users. In here, we've also given an example of how with an incentive similar to say an existing incentive for large users to do demand response, the same dollars there could go towards funding distributed customers, and the distributed customer may, because of what they're looking at as an additional backup generation benefit, they may be willing to kind of have some of the costs, take on some of that cost. And so your same dollars spent, even though the end user is paying more, it's still something that might make sense across the board. So we see a lot of potential benefits for a virtual power plant, building that out, and would like to just make sure that that's being discussed among all the parties as we look towards this.
I also wanted to give Voltus the opportunity, since it's in the same sort of vein, to discuss its proposal on demand response aggregators of retail customers. Voltus would like to speak at this time.
Hi, this is Joanne Worthington. I'm the Senior Manager of Regulatory Affairs at Voltus. And we've submitted some comments in the docket. I know that a lot of the discussion has been about more sort of granular rate-making issues, but we did want to raise this issue with the Iowa Utilities Board because it's been, around 15 years since the IUB elected to opt out of FERC Order 719. And there's been a lot of development in the space since that time. And so we would love for the Iowa Utilities Board to take another look at this issue. I know there's a question about legislative change. We don't feel that that's necessary, but we also feel that that's something that could be explored in a docket more specifically directed at those issues so that we could talk about the legal issues. Most states have similar statutes and have not found them restrictive with respect to permitting participation in wholesale markets by ARCs. They have exclusive territory statutes and sale for resale and that sort of things, and those haven't, been implicated. I would also point out that with the issuance of FERC Order 2222, which does not have a state opt-out and allows participation of DERs, which can include demand response if it's part of a heterogeneous aggregation, which basically means that a more complicated aggregation is something that you'll have to permit, that it's really beneficial, or at least some states I think have found it beneficial to at least begin with demand response, which is a little less complex because it's not injecting into the system. You don't have heterogeneous aggregations. So it'll give you a chance to sort of observe how it operates within the regulatory construct. So it's something we would just like the Iowa Utilities Board to consider, delving a little bit more deeply into and reconsidering, because there's just been a lot of development in the space since Iowa made the decision to opt out of FERC Order 719, which permitted or which tried to remove barriers to participation of loads and wholesale demand response programs. I appreciate the time. Thank you.
Carrie.
Yes, so Carrie Johansson with the Iowa Environmental Council. So I think similar to what was mentioned earlier by Jennifer, I think we would see energy efficiency and demand response be included as a selectable resource in an integrated resource planning process. And so the goals that would end up being set for achievement of certain levels of savings would be an output of the IRP. And we think that would necessitate changes to the statute as it currently exists, which already, creates some just some skewed results when we're trying to look at what kind of energy efficiency makes sense, and that would just be exacerbated if we were this into an IRP. So yes, we definitely would support removing the spending caps on energy efficiency and demand response. Also replacing the RIM test with maybe a jurisdiction-specific test, as Cecil mentioned, or using a couple of the other tests that are in existence that give more of a fair balance on evaluation of cost effectiveness. We agree that, energy efficiency, especially in demand response as they're identified in an IRP and as they're run through the cost effectiveness tests, like by the nature of doing those analyses, you're looking at a resource that has been determined to be cost effective for the system. And so everybody should pay for that just the same way we would pay for everything else. And then I think we think that there's a lot of opportunity for moving forward with some of these new ideas around virtual power plants, aggregation. There's room in this space for introducing some new ideas and maybe a little bit of injecting a little bit of just different ways of ideas of ways to do things. So I'm not sure that that some of the virtual power plant stuff, I think, yes, could be part of the demand response. Some of that maybe could fall into like a distribution planning process that kind of harkens back to it feels like 3 years ago this morning when we were talking about integrated resource planning. But a distribution system plan would also help you get to some of those questions about where projects like that would be the most beneficial and most likely to save in infrastructure funding, funding for infrastructure that customers also have to pay for. So could fit in a couple buckets.
Jennifer?
Thanks. I just wanted to express appreciation for Voltus hanging on with us. And I feel like I don't understand the issue well enough to comment on it. I wondered if maybe the utilities have a view on it. You know, do the utilities want to be playing the role of an aggregator? I mean, so far they haven't done that. And I don't know, you know, if customers are not crazy about that idea either. I'm just curious, what are the reasons for prohibiting aggregation of demand?
And we addressed some of those in our comments. I think what we were really hopeful is we understand there are a lot of questions. And I think what we are hoping to encourage the board to do is maybe have another docket and just reassess their opt-out. And just given the passage of time since that was done 15 years ago, there's been a lot of development around the country. Michigan lifted their opt-out. In December of last year, Missouri just lifted their opt-out last month, and really 3 weeks ago, and FERC Order 2222 shows sort of where the federal policy is on this. That is just a good opportunity, even if you're just looking at the FERC Order 2222 implementation that some states are starting to open up. There's just some opportunities to explore the issue and maybe have a stakeholder process about that issue more specifically. I know you probably can't resolve it in the context of all the different moving parts and topics that are being discussed in this charrette and in this docket.
Eric, did you still have a comment and response? Bob.
Thank you. Bob Byrd, Senate Republican Caucus staff. An argument that I saw in comments on this related to the benefits of energy efficiency and demand response, being the avoidance of the need for additional generating capacity to meet peak demand. Are there other benefits that we should be thinking about? I think that the board's rules include, for certain tests, a societal benefit. Are there other things that I guess help me understand, aside from avoiding incremental peak capacity, what are the benefits that we're investing in here?
Aurelian, to start.
I would just, I'm certainly not the full expert on this, but I would assume one benefit is, shaving peak during high demand times should lead to, lower energy costs of purchasing that energy at those times as well, because it reduces stress on the market.
Debbie.
Yeah, a few others are, I mean, when you build a system, you have to build a reserve margin, right? And any load you don't have to meet, then you also don't have to build the reserve margin on top of that. You don't have to build the extra generation resources on top of that. You also don't have to worry about environmental regulations and reducing emissions or meeting regulations for power plants that have outputs. You don't have to worry about the the fuel supply and whether there will be challenges with that. So there are a lot of things that you avoid that are required to generate electricity when you don't have to generate that electricity.
Amanda.
You. I haven't spoken yet today, so let me introduce myself. My name is Amanda James. I'm representing the Iowa Association of Electric Cooperatives. And we think of those values that you just mentioned, Debbie, you know, is something that really is the outcome of demand response. So that's why you do it, right? To avoid those incremental costs. But what we want to really, you know, share with you today is that the reason we wouldn't necessarily support aggregation of demand response is because the cooperatives, the GNTs, the generation and transmission cooperatives already spend a ton of money on switches and demand response programs. Landis and Gear comes out and is making each of our distribution co-ops available to react to those kind of things. So when we need to ask for a demand response trigger, it's able to do so. And so requiring or allowing the aggregation of customers to do their own demand response would ultimately leave the GNTs in a position of stranded costs and excessive expense that they are having to, you know, hold the bag for, that that's actually working really well for them. So to your point, thank you for bringing those out, that we're already investing in that, and there's got to be a way that utilities can do that. It's not that.
Jim on Zoom.
Yeah, thank you. Jim Martin Schramm, Clean Energy Districts of Iowa. Just a quick response to the Republican caucus staff about why would the state of Iowa encourage investments in energy efficiency. First of all, it tends to be the lowest cost resource compared to other resources. At least that's been the case historically. But I think perhaps the most important reason is it's one of the few ways that our state empowers ratepayers to take control over their rising energy costs, which for some utilities is for the customers of some utilities is a really significant burden. So you know, I guess that's a societal benefit, but it's a way that customers can gain some resources to help them make investments to reduce their costs. And that seems to me to be pretty valid reason.
Bob, quickly in response.
Assuming rates are designed to recover the cost of service, don't they provide the proper incentives for people to implement energy efficiency?
I assume that question is posed to me, and forgive me, perhaps not.
It was proposed to the room, Jim.
Okay.
Carrie in response.
Yep, I'm happy to respond. So I think that it's a matter of it's not about whether customers want to have lower energy bills, because everybody wants to have a lower energy bill, and paying increasingly high rates, yes, will hopefully drive people to even more to want to save energy. But it's a path that you're going, like, as from the utility perspective and the system perspective as a whole, you know, going this direction of, okay, so our load is going to grow by, you know, 2% next year, or that, you know, 1% per year, and we're going to end up needing X amount of capacity as we go forward. How do we meet that projected capacity need? Do we build more generation and then earn a, you know, 9 to 11% rate of return on top of that investment? Or do we encourage customers to do energy efficiency so that we don't have to build that level of load? And you can see where on this, you know, on the one hand, you end up with more generation, a bigger generation system, more rate base that everybody is paying for. And on the other hand, you don't. And so I think that's where we see it's not a matter of, do customers want to save money? It's a matter of, does it make sense for the whole system to just not build that stuff? It's cheaper for everybody, and it's better for customers at the end of the day to see energy efficiency as a resource and really use it that way.
Dean, did you have a comment?
No, on that topic. So if that topic wants to keep going,
Joanne on Zoom.
I was just going to address the question that was asked about whether customers would be appropriately incented just by rates to pursue energy efficiency. So before I worked for Voltus, I started in May. I worked for Public Service Company of Oklahoma for 15 years. And they've gotten several DOE Energy Star awards for their demand response and energy efficiency programs that are approved by the Oklahoma Commission. And one of the things that they learned, and I worked with them over my 15 years there on commission activity and approval of those programs, is that customers need education and support to really be effective. And sometimes there's rate design issues that are more encouraging. So I'm not really here to talk about retail demand response, but I thought I would offer that perspective that customers aren't always educated or have the resources that they need. Like if they need to improve their their envelope of their home, there are programs that help do those things, for example, or if they need tariff provisions that help them shift out of peak time. So there's all sorts of things that the utility can help customers do that they may not have either, the education or the resources to achieve on their own. And then I think the other speaker talked about scaling them. When the utility is doing them, they can do it sort of at a scale to have it approach, a resource so that you can have avoided costs or peak shaving or all the things that you want to do to benefit the whole system and benefit customers. So I would just interject, probably out of turn, but just offer those responses to some of the questions.
Is this in response to the question, Benjamin?
I guess just to kind of bring this full circle back to what Bob said at the very beginning, pricing may incentivize energy efficiency for customers. It probably will not incentivize demand response without the utilities being involved in doing the incentives themselves.
Dane Stevens, Mid-American, and I'm not an expert at all on this topic, but I am aware that MISO is investigating demand response and how it can be counted as a resource, in the resource adequacy environment. It seems to me they're raising the bar quite a bit on how demand response, what sort of attributes would be needed in order for demand response to be counted towards your planning reserve margin requirement. And I think where they're headed is, if I'm not mistaken, like a 30-minute response time. And what I'm hearing is that that's gonna be very, very difficult for parties to design demand response programs that can meet that requirement. But why MISO is headed in that direction is the tight margin hours are no longer the hours that used to be very, very, predictable in advance. It used to be, Wednesday, July 15th at 6 p.m. Everyone knew that was going to be a 100-degree day. That was going to be the time. But now they're finding, they're projecting to be the case that the tight margin hours are going to be twilight hours. So 7 p.m., 8 p.m. in the summer, for example, which is well past the traditional, gross peak of the utility. And then it can even come at very oddball times and conditions, spring, fall. It might be 60 degrees outside, but you'd be calling on demand response resources, times and conditions where a lot of customers aren't expecting that and maybe aren't prepared to deliver that into the program. So yeah, I'm on the periphery, but I'm aware that there's a lot of MISO discussions around that. Those who are interested in this topic should be aware of, just in terms of that resource. I'm not gonna be able to answer any questions on it. You have to jump on the MISO website and research it to your heart's content. I'm already way over my tips on it. So.
Debbie, did you have comments?
Yeah, I was going to respond to something that was said earlier, but if you're going to respond to the MISO comment, please go ahead.
Sure. Dane, thanks for sharing.
You're still gonna ask me?
No, it's no question. I think thanks for sharing that, and I think it's a nice example of, for me anyways, where the residential in particular distributed virtual power plant battery situation would work really well because we know with a business user if it's something, a demand response situation that comes up when they're not expecting it, it may be very challenging for them to work through it. If you've got a set of residential batteries that are really there for backup purposes, you're less likely, particularly in a distributed situation, to have all those resources not available when you're hitting peak demand. And so I think that really is a perfect example of where that would be a big benefit overall.
Matt.
Matt with Alliant. I think I am also not an expert at virtual power plants, and we do have people that are employed at Alliant who work in this field and could probably do a lot more justice to answering these questions. But I think something that I want to make sure everyone understands is that these programs aren't free as we get into residential and more dispersed generating resources. That requires an advanced distribution grid and a lot of spend to make sure that we have the ability to interconnect all of these, allow them to connect and actually generate and allow bi-directional flow, all kinds of things. So there are costs that come with this. It doesn't mean that we are anti-distributed resources, but I think everyone needs to go into this eyes wide open. There are costs to all of these distributed resources and connecting them.
Marcos?
Marcos Munoz with OCA. Dane, I'm sorry. I'm gonna have to answer you. So I guess with what you were saying, and this is legitimately just a curiosity question. I think some of the arguments with the demand response within the energy efficiency construct is that it allows for the control of the utility. And I think when you were saying that, I kind of wanted to just ask, like, I know that utilities use it as part of their FRAP when they submit their, to get their CRC in MISO. Is your argument more, I guess, intended to, I know you're not necessarily making an opinion. Does it make sense then to have it on the utilities control? Or I guess just more on the Volch's point, is it better to have a decentralized process for large aggregators to provide the resources? Like, how does a utility get harmed? I guess that will be the question if there is a decentralized process for demand response to buy that capacity in the market or however it works. So I'm not really sure how it works either, but I guess I don't know whatever, if you have any comments or inputs, because I'm trying to sort it out too.
Yeah, I think Marcos, we'd have to just set up a time with someone else within Mid-American to sit down with you and kind of go over that. All I'm saying is kind of what I've heard. And again, I'm on the periphery of it. The hall room chatter, the drinking fountain chatter that I've been hearing is it's going to make it, if MISO proceeds with what they've been talking about, what I've been hearing is it's going to make it difficult for demand response resources to be counted towards the resource adequacy requirements. I don't know much more. I remember the 30-minute thing coming up, but beyond that, I don't remember. So, but we can have a discussion on
that. Bob?
Yeah. Oh, on Rafferty. I think we need to realize in 6, 7, 8 years, we're not quite sure. We're sort of guessing where the technology is going to be, whether the grid's able to really manage this distributed demand response. But the potential is pretty significant, and we've been seeing the change. We see the virtual power plants that are actually, put into actual practice in Texas and California during the recent hot spells. So I think what we should, at least, I think should be considered is making sure the framework's there. So if economically it makes sense to pursue it, it provides the reliability or enhanced reliability that we shouldn't have an artificial restriction such as a 2% limit on demand response. If it shows, boy, it would make a lot of economic sense to spend 5% on this in 2030. So let's perhaps set up the process so it maximizes the economic and reliable potential that may exist 3, 4, 5, 8 years. Thank you.
John?
Josh Clark, I said it.
Josh, sorry.
That's all right. I wanted to actually speak a little bit to what Matt just a minute ago said about these distributed resources having a cost. That agreed. And I think that's one of the things that we at ISETA would like to put out there about the benefit of virtual net metering as kind of not really a change to current net metering as codified, just an enhancement where if we could allow, projects to be built and have ratepayers be connected via virtual net metering, we could then see less total number physical distributed generation resources, but at the same time, more people being able to actually take advantage of those distributed generation resources. So we see virtual net metering as a good way to both increase the ability for people to take advantage of renewable energy and potentially even lessening the burden on the utilities to provide
that. Joanne on Zoom.
I just neglected to lower my hand from earlier. My apologies.
Any additional comments regarding energy efficiency and demand response? All right, we'll move to the next topic for discussion then for trackers and riders. The proposed modifications to trackers and riders encompass measures such as ensuring costs within the utilities purview, reviewing the existing trackers, avoiding the right of first refusal laws, and broadening the tracker scope. So some suggested changes to address the issues included here include promoting competition and market efficiency through the removal of the ROFR laws, LEG specifically proposing that the transmission cost rider be repealed to address that the current trackers are limited in scope, expanding the trackers to include other types of capital expenditures for gas and water industries. Black Hills Energy specifically opposes the use of cost of debt in the determination of the recovery factor, suggesting to replace it with the weighted average cost of capital. And then IBEX states that costs that are within the utilities control should not be allowed as trackers and riders, that these trackers should be reviewed and be subject to reconciliation on at least an annual basis. And so with questions for discussion on this topic, should the IUB treat all utilities similarly with regards to the establishment of trackers? What criteria should be used to determine whether a cost should be allowed as a tracker? Are there existing trackers and riders that should no longer be authorized and applied as trackers and riders? Do you agree with IBEC's suggestion that trackers should be reviewed and subject to reconciliation on a regular basis? How long should it be between each review, if so? And do you agree with Mr. Wright's statement that including requirements for trackers in law would limit the decision-making authority on the part of the IUB? So that I'll open it up for any comments on these trackers and riders.
Ben Flickinger with the Large Energy Group. I guess I'll just say you pretty accurately summarized our comments, so I won't repeat those talking points. I guess as far as what criteria should be used, whether a tracker should be allowed or not, I mean, the board's consistently, held that at least for the most trackers, it's things outside of the utility's control. So, the traditional like PGA is, the cost of just procuring the gas infrastructure tracker is, government mandated moves, investments due to safety regulation changes, things like that. The EAC on the electrical side is similar to the PGA. So I think starting from that point where it's a tracker and a rider or for things generally outside utilities control, I think it's a good starting point.
Adam Berman for Black Hills Energy. We've filed comments throughout this proceeding. I don't want to overstate them. We certainly support the use of trackers, certainly with under certain circumstances. I think there's probably some benefits to having some consistency between utilities, but understanding the board's authority and control that there probably are other circumstances where there could be different treatment for different utilities. And so that's probably on a case by case basis, but we do believe that there are benefits to having some consistency so that there's not disproportionate treatment. We've filed some comments on one particular existing tracker and provided some red lines how we believe it could be updated to better support the General Assembly's policy objectives. One promoting safe, reliable, and adequate service. And that's in regards to the integrity chapter found in chapter 19.18. With just a few, if you look at the comments, they're relatively modest red lines, but really establishes, I think, three core principles with the focus on updating safety and integrity spend or projects that really focus on the company's DIMP and TIMP, which is really the most high-risk assets identified as part of that PHMSA DIMP and TIMP process. Doing a forward-looking review, which we have proposed incorporates a forward-looking approval and adjustment, which promotes, make sure that we are having just and reasonable rates as part of that process. And then thirdly, updating to a weighted average cost of capital versus cost of debt to align with the General Assembly's policy of accurately reflecting the cost of service. When we make those investments, we're doing those so with paying for those with equity and debt, and the WACC better reflects that cost of service. So.
Dane? Yeah, Dane Stevens, Mid-American. Just want to respond on the last item in the table, IBEC's comment that Mid-American's transmission cost rider includes costs under our control. Just want to push back on that. I don't believe that's true. Mid-American's transmission costs, bundled retail rates were set in the 2013 rate case. So all of our transmission costs at that point in time were included in the development, in our cost of service, the development of rates. The cost that Mid-American is passing through the transmission cost adjustment rider do not include those types of transmission investments. So transmission investments to serve, new large customer loads, system reliability, rebuilds, all that kind of. None of those costs are in any tracker in Iowa. And the only costs that come through are the MISO transmission costs, as well as some other MISO transmission or reliability administration costs. One small exception would be, and this again is in the 2013 rate case testimony, and what we're doing is the Mid-American's investments in the multi-value projects are, those are regionally cost allocated projects. So Iowa is allocated about Mid-American is allocated about 5% of the annual revenue requirements of the multi-value project transmission investments. Iowa gets an allocation of that, and that is the one exception to what the costs that are coming back through the transmission riders. So the vast majority of Mid-American's transmission costs, those are direct transmission costs, are not being passed through the rider. I want to make that clarification. I'm not sure if that, if whoever at IBEC wants to talk about that, I'd be willing to go over that.
Jennifer.
Jennifer Easler. We filed pretty extensive comments and suggestions on the trackers and riders, and I won't go through all of those, but we agree with LAG about the criteria that should be used. It should focus on costs that are beyond a utility's control. And now that utilities have the option of filing for future test year rate cases, they have the ability to project their costs going forward, and that should reduce the need for infrastructure trackers. And we think that for a utility that elects that type of treatment, it's probably appropriate to review the conditions that the board imposes, on that. We think the cost of debt is appropriate on capital infrastructure trackers because it, helps make sure that a utility isn't using that tracker to expand their rate base without proper review. We agree with Mr. Wright's statement that the board is in the best position to evaluate the need for a tracker, and it's not, I think, establishing a particular treatment in legislation could be short-sighted and unnecessarily, limit what the right treatment is going forward. We believe that there are, for trackers, that they are subject to reconciliation on a regular basis. So, and that should be continued.
Hi, Margaret Williams with Iowa American Water. Got to introduce myself earlier. Apologize. Iowa American, we propose a need for trackers. So as far as should IUB treat all utilities similarly, that is based on the situation we're presenting when we ask for these things. For water, like Adam said, we just don't have as many trackers as energy, which makes sense. There's different needs there, but we do have needs, depend on our industry. And as far as criteria, the things we've presented were things out of our control, like with production costs, pass through, or there's no return on it, so customers should pay no more and no less. So it works both ways as far as that, and it would be reconciled, which I totally agree with OCA on that. We also presented improvements to our QIP, the Qualified Infrastructure Plant mechanism. Right now, we're looking at, it basically looks at replacement of costs that have already been approved. So we do a lot of replacement for lead, but there's other reasons to do those replacements for underground assets. And then the tracker in our comments, I won't go into it too much, but we did present another idea for capital that's needed outside of the utilities control due to compliance to build whatever the project is needed that would adhere to a safety issue, health issues, or environmental issues. And I think, oh yes, first trackers in law. I think that, especially with like pass-through costs, the IUB completely has authority to make those decisions. They've shown that in the past, there's nothing different there. But as far as legislative, we did point out the fact that our QIP we're using now, we made in comments before, is actually in the granted to us through the natural gas chapter, which is chapter 19. And the modifications we presented in our comments was to basically add up the water version to our chapter, which is 21. That way the law is more concise.
Barry?
Yeah, so I just wanted to mention, and I'm not sure if this is exactly the right place, but we have raised in our Charrette 2 filings the idea of fuel cost sharing. So fuel costs are currently done through a tracker. There are multiple states who do a cost sharing mechanism there because that is somewhat in the control of the utility. And so, for example, Wyoming is a state that has 80% the costs go through the tracker, 20% are shared. A couple of other states that do that are Idaho, Missouri, Montana, and Wisconsin. And so we would just want to put that back on the table for discussion as something the board should consider.
Herman, I won't repeat a lot of the comments, but I will agree with some of them and add a little bit of additional detail. So as far as what criteria should be used to determine whether a cost should be allowed on a track or not, it is on a case-by-case basis, project by project. For us, we do agree with that. Those are projects that are subject to sudden change or beyond the cost control management. Do agree with that. With IBEC's suggestion that trackers should be reviewed and subject to reconciliation on a regular basis, that is pretty much the standard in 199 AAC 19.18. So I would agree with that as well. And in regard to Mr. Wright's comment about including the requirements for trackers in the law, whether or not it would limit decision-making capability as part of the IUB, I think one nice thing is that because it's not within statute and it is within rules, it allows the board flexibility to make any changes they so desire. So I will say that we're very appreciative of the mechanism that's currently out there and with that and any of the proposed changes that we'll take into consideration.
Rachel Niemeyer, Iowa American Water. Just want to add a couple things. Similarly treated utilities, yes, but each one is individual and a case by case for both treatment across utilities, but also the criteria for which we're seeking it. I think that's important for the board to remain in the forefront of their minds when they make the decisions. It is helpful to have it in a rule. Again, like Brooke said, it gives the board discretion, but it also gives the utility some guidance and OCA guidance and the board staff guidance on what's required and what needs to be approved to allow that tracker review and how it goes. So of course, I think that's important. And we appreciate the board's forward-looking decision to allow us to fall under the natural gas regulation, but we think it would be clearer and easier if it was under the water. So that discretion is evident in that decision, but it could be more clear and that would be more helpful to the water and wastewater industry.
So I think we've discussed this in the prior threads, but I just want to point out that the tracker allows the utility to recover costs outside of a general rate case proceeding. It reduces the risk on the utility of recovering of those amounts. It also allows them to avoid regulatory lag, some regulatory lag with regard to those. So I think in any tracker, that reduction in risk and the benefits that the utility gets from or receives from being able to recover those costs annually rather than a general rate case proceeding need to be taken into account when you determine what costs should be recovered and whether they should earn a return on those costs.
Any other thoughts on this time on trackers and riders or any of the discussion questions? All right, we will move to the last topic of discussion for today, the water acquisition procedures. Stakeholders suggest that there's a need to streamline the water acquisition process with the issues or comments being that the IAWC stated in previous written comments, these are from the pre-Charrette 1 written comments, that the acquisition process is cumbersome and costly to the community. And they suggested to streamline the process for acquisition of smaller distressed systems, which would be more efficient and beneficial for consumers, the acquiring utility, and the board. and also to increase the fair market value threshold included in Iowa Code, section 476.84. Mr. Wright believes that acquisition can be less resource intensive if the full rate proceeding is not included at the time of the acquisition. The suggested change being to allow the rate regulated utility to file temporary rates until the next general rate case proceeding. And lastly, IAWC notes that transaction costs are currently not included in acquisition approval cases, with the suggested change being to include these expenses, and they should, and as well as the IAB staff board and OCA expenses, they should be recoverable in these acquisition approval cases. And moving to the discussion questions for water acquisition procedures being, what role do the water acquisition rules and procedures have today in ensuring safe, adequate, reliable, and affordable services for the House File policy objectives? What principles, in addition to the costs associated with the acquisition, should be considered by the IUB when deciding on a water acquisition application? And should the acquiring utility be allowed to file temporary rates that go into effect upon execution of the acquisition? Would these rates be just and reasonable? And so with that, I will open it up for comments. Tim.
Tim Whipple, the Iowa Association of Municipal Utilities. We have a different set of concerns with the current statute for water acquisitions. It is not currently costly to communities. They're not even a party to these transactions at the board. It's inconvenient to the acquiring utility to have to go through as many hoops, but that's not the same thing. We also are concerned that the current statutory requirement that says there should be a rate making determination at the outcome of the proceeding is already available to set what the rates should be. And we think that needs to be done because the acquired system has a right to back out of the transaction according to the statute. And so the community needs to have certain, in order to sell its existing system, it has to go through a vote. And if voters vote to sell the system based on their expectations about the acquisition cost and about the rate making treatment after the acquisition, those do not turn out to their liking in the board proceeding, they need to be able to back out of the transaction. So if the acquisition doesn't produce those kinds of certainties, then it's not working well for communities' needs either from our perspective. We also think there needs to be a strong evidentiary requirement that all of the municipal law requirements are followed. If they're not followed, the transactions are void, some of them are voidable, but some of them are just void ab initio, depending on what parts of municipal law are violated. So the board should look and verify whether those requirements are met. And they have not been met in every transaction. And that makes those transactions risky for all parties concerned. Those are our concerns with the rate making statute as it currently stands.
Any additional comments in response or any additional thoughts on these water acquisition procedures? Yes.
John Crotty with OCA. Our primary concern is that there seems to be a precedent established with the board's first acquisition decision in which we have a framework now where we are guaranteeing that the utility is going to recover its purchase price, but there's no consideration given to who they're going to recover it from. And we think that is inconsistent with the statute, as Mr. Whipple mentioned. We think the statute is clear that the fundamental questions of the acquisition are supposed to be determined by the board, and then both parties have a chance to walk away from it. With this approach, there's tremendous uncertainty about kind of the fundamental questions of the acquisition. We think that's inconsistent with the statute. From our perspective, it would be better to embark on a framework where the utility just goes ahead and acquires the municipality without board. this is kind of, Mr. Wright suggested temporary rates framework. We consider that preferable to what we've got right now, where you are giving certainty to the utility that you're gonna recover this money from somebody and we'll figure out later from who. If the utility was at its own risk as to whether it was gonna recover at all, we think that would produce incentive to make sure that these acquisitions that they're pursuing actually make sense for their existing customers. And I guess we just fundamentally believe that the board cannot find that an acquisition will produce just and reasonable rates for existing customers without giving any consideration to the question of, are the existing customers gonna have to pay for this?
Tim, in response.
Just to build on what Mr. Crotty said, the kind of certainty that a community would need is to know whether the tariff is going to be bifurcated and that all the costs of acquisition are going to be pushed back onto the community. Because that would definitely be a situation in which that community may want to back out, because it might rationally make the decision that it's to its advantage as a community to keep its system rather than sell it. So if it doesn't get that kind of certainty, the advanced rate making statute doesn't afford much of an advantage to a community either.
Rachel Niemeyer, Iowa American Water Company. As to the first question, what role do water acquisition rules and procedures have today to ensure safe, adequate, reliable, and affordable services? These are communities where the mayors and the citizens of those communities have decided that they are unwilling or unable to operate their system. And so allowing an acquisition definitely ensures that they are under the purview of a regulated entity that provides safe, adequate, reliable, and affordable services based on the board's review of the rates and the board's review of the acquisition process and the rates that result from that process in the interim until a new rate case can be filed. Those cities often can't comply with requirements from DNR or EPA. That is going to be an increased burden as we move forward in time with certain things coming down the pipeline, like lead service lines, but also PFAS. So, these acquisitions are important to the citizens of Iowa to ensure that they have safe and adequate service. For the second question, I'm not sure what principles you're kind of referencing there, but I think that the IUB can consider certainly the vote of the people, certainly what documents are provided from those cities, what the utility has provided and the analysis that they've provided. They have OCA's analysis as well, and they are able to use that information and analyze it and create a decision based on that evidence to support the decision and the rate until the next general rate case where everything can be looked at as a whole. In the meantime, the citizens have a set answer. Iowa American has a set answer as to what we can do to move forward with the acquisition, what improvements we can make, what investment we can make, what expenses we can allocate. We are able to plan accordingly. So I think there are definitely principles that the board can consider, and I think the current process provides ample opportunity for that. I think the current process, as we've advocated in our comments, can be enhanced in a variety of ways to assist the board in continuing to make decisions based on the evidence presented and fully vetted. The third one. The temporary rates is a new concept in this round of the charrettes, and that may work for some systems. We just file a tariff and then the acquisition could be considered within a rate case. However, that's going to be burdensome on larger acquisitions. And I think that that would be more difficult for the board to come to a just and reasonable rate if we're just filing a tariff and they don't have anything else to look at and base that decision or approval upon. And I think that provides uncertainty both for Iowa American, the utility that's acquiring, but also for the citizens that are wanting to get rid of the system. I think that delay in process, while they're advocating that it's giving them more certainty, I don't think that's the case. I don't think just a rate change is enough to give them the certainty that has been advocated they would get here. John, I realize you have your thing, so I'll let you.
John Tack, IUB. Mr. Crotty, would it, if the statute required purchase price in excess of debt to be paid as bill credits, would that resolve the concern, the issue?
You mean paid by the acquired utility?
No, so if you acquire a sewer system and you acquire it for $1 million and there's 500,000 in debt, you pay the city 500,000, you pay the remaining purchase price as bill credits to customers.
I'm not sure I'm following you, bill credits. Are you suggesting that
The customers get the purchase price instead of the city?
customers? Maybe, yeah. I mean, I think that raises a question though, is even paying for the amount of the debt fair to existing customers? You know, I think there needs to be an evaluation of whether, how will the existing customers benefit from this transaction? And you know, there seems to have been assertions that there's going to be economies of scale created, but there's no analysis supporting that. So we submitted evidence in the record for this last acquisition that Iowa American was going to have to triple its entire existing rate base before the existing customers would see any benefit.
Can you speak up, John?
Yeah. We believe that there needs to be some quantitative analysis about how existing customers are going to benefit from these transactions. We submitted evidence in this most recent acquisition case that Iowa American was going to have to triple its entire existing rate base before the existing customers would see any benefit at all from economies of scale. And that analysis, it wasn't really contradicted in any way. It didn't seem to be considered by the board in any way. The board seems to have just taken this approach that, well, be that as it may, we'll just deal with that later. And I guess we just think that that's bad policy, and it's going to make it harder to do the right thing for existing customers down the road. And I guess we just don't see the reason for why it needs to be that way.
I mean, this whole, everything gets tricky here because everyone else in the room, drinking water, electricity, gas, you're selling a product. We're structured around a product-based evaluation and rate making. You've got a situation where a service is being sold rather than a good. The current owner is not selling it, not providing adequate service. They have to have the legislature order multiple appraisals to determine evaluation. They're not trusted to value the utility on their own. The board has to determine compliance with municipal law, that they're not deferred to determine their own compliance with municipal law. And then you have this strange rate structure where the purchase price is being paid to the utility, which has presumably been funded by the customers, but then the customers have to refund the purchase price. I mean, it's a quagmire, and further direction would be appreciated. If the legislature wishes to give further direction on that quagmire, or maybe we can come up with something from this group, but it would all be helpful.
Or Rachel in response?
Just quickly, I don't think that it's guaranteed to come from the ratepayers. I think the shareholders could bear that burden, and I don't think there's been any evidence to suggest otherwise. I think that that's a bit of a generalization that I don't believe is 100% accurate. So I just want to put that out there. And I think looking at an acquisition of particularly a small system where it's a fraction of a percent of the total revenue in isolation is going to create problems in a general rate case. I think there's a reason that there's a general rate case process where the board looks at all relevant factors. And to isolate one item out of that and make a decision in an acquisition case based on an incomplete record is a dangerous and slippery slope for the board to walk down. And so I think they need to do that with caution. Again, this whole thing started because there's policies in place in Iowa, and we want to make sure we're upholding those policies. The policy of the acquisition statute is to help these systems and help these citizens get safe and adequate service. And that cannot be overlooked or overstated, the importance of that. So we can get in the details and the weeds of each of the cases that we've had so far, but those are isolated. And I think it's important to pull back and look at the overall policy in this particular juncture of Charrette, if it's not an active case.
So if I remember our prior discussions on this issue, that there's a question of the acquired customer being able to understand or know what the rates they would be charged are if the acquisition goes through. But on the other side of it, I thought that utility said that the current process really costs too much. They spend a lot more in resources and cost in what they're getting when they acquire this. And I think one of the questions is you're not allowed to include those transaction costs in your rates. So I think everyone can agree that the current statute needs to be revised. At least I think so. I think I would try to make it simpler, more straightforward. Whether you need to go as far as I have with my alternative, which is just put the rates in and then you work these things out in a rate case where you have the opportunity to review all of the information and the board gets a chance to make a decision in the general rate case proceeding. Because it seems to me all the things that are being talked about is about what to do in the acquisition proceeding almost turns that into a mini rate case, which I think goes to the question of cost. And I agree that the utility is offering to acquire these municipals because there's some issue with the municipality continuing to provide the service. So, should that result in a mini rate case at the beginning, or should that be deferred until the general rate case? I think for me, it's trying to simplify it. What elements need to be decided when the acquisition occurs? And just looking at it and not, I understand Tim's position, but I don't even know that the board needs to approve these acquisitions. What the utility needs is they need the board approved tariff in order to charge these customers the rates for the service. So maybe you don't even need approval of the acquisition. If you do need approval of the acquisition, then what advanced rate making do you need to decide in order to allow the board to approve what the rates will be? Because you can't charge these customers rates unless the board approves it. So you've got that, and so then what are those elements? What are those advanced rate making principles that you need to adopt? I don't think anyone proposes that you adopt a rate making principle that the rates approved in the acquisition docket are the rates that those customers will pay throughout the life of the facility. Rates are set, should be set in a general rate case proceeding. So how do you balance all of that and come up with a process that is not resource intensive, but also allows the customers being acquired to know what they're going to be charged if that acquisition is approved, at least until the next rate case?
So I do think there's one compelling instance where you would want to go through an advance approval, Cecil, and that is if, as Mr. Crotty says, the proposed acquisition price is 2 or 3 times the rate base, right? Because if you went into a general rate case, having entered into a transaction like that, I think there's risk that the OCA or other parties would challenge the prudency of that acquisition. Maybe you wouldn't get recovery of all your acquisition costs. Is that a situation that could arise? John, do you think, how much certainty is there if you're overpaying for a system?
Okay, let me answer that first, okay? So I think that's the risk they run for paying too much for the system. I mean, in your negotiation, the company's negotiations, they need to pay a reasonable price for it. And that's the price that goes into rate base. And if they don't pay a prudent, reasonable price for it, then they shouldn't get to recover. And I think that's best determined in a rate case, but you can determine it up front if you want.
And it may or may not have anything to do with their acquisition. If there's just a huge amount of debt, the system's already incurred, that was incurred under the city's management.
Well, if they're accepting debt, then that needs to be part of the negotiation. I mean, maybe they shouldn't pay anything for it, they just accept the debt.
But all of you guys are raising facts, not an issue. We're making a general law based on facts that aren't present necessarily, that are what ifs. And so what better place to make those decisions than a process at the board about the acquiring system? There are things in place to look at price. There's the APA, there are the appraisals. Those are taken into consideration. And so those things are looked at in this process. And while there can be a shortened process for certain acquisitions, I think, there's a place where a lengthier process is appropriate. So this whole debate is I think, a hypothetical that isn't necessarily applicable to the purpose of these charrettes.
One more comment. I think the problem comes back to the fact that the board has decided to grant certainty to the acquiring utility that you are going to recover this purchase price from somebody. And then that is set in stone. And so then at a later date, now we're going to do the hard work of figuring out who is going to pay for this. And I don't think it's adequate to just rely on the appraisals. I mean, the appraisals are trying to establish the fair market value of these systems. And I mean, you can imagine a hypothetical, this is probably an extreme case, but if you picture some small town and they have a badly polluted well, and so they install a state-of-the-art treatment system, very expensive. And then once it's up and running, they say, we'd like to sell the system to Iowa American. The appraisers come in, they say, yes, this is a very expensive system, here's what it costs. Okay, that's fair market value, but does that mean that it's wise for Iowa American to go and purchase that system? And is it fair for the existing customers to have to subsidize that? So we feel that if you're going to be granting certainty that there's going to be cost recovery, you also need to address at that time who's going to pay for it. And that second question should require some sort of quantitative analysis about why is this in the best interest of your existing customers to do this? If you say there are economies of scale, show us the math behind that and make a demonstration rather than just saying, approve it now and we'll show you that later, once it's done.
Any final comments on this, Cecil?
So I disagree. I think the purpose here of the charrette is what to propose the legislature to change the current statute. And it is not hypothetical. You've had the current statute applied to you twice, at least, and you haven't found it satisfactory. So it needs to be changed. And the question is, how do you change it? I'm not telling you my solution is the best, but I think it needs to be changed where it's more streamlined. It is specific about what advanced rate making principles need to be applied. And I think the question that John raises about who's going to pay for this is a rate case issue. And I don't think you can decide that in the acquisition doctrine. Because if you do all of that, then you're really creating a mini rate case at the point of the acquisition. And if that's what you want, that's fine. But I don't think that's appropriate.
Any final comments? All right, so with that, we will move to just any closing remarks and next steps. So this was the last topic that we had for discussion today. Any next steps will just involve similar to the previous charrettes where 1 week from today, so November 8th, stakeholders will have the opportunity to submit post-charrette written comments to address any of the discussions that we had today or mechanisms raised in the discussion questions and prompts for today, as well as anything that may have been missed that should be discussed or looked at further by LEI. And then with the deadline for the legislative report on the 1st, final comments from IB staff.
Just thanks for the participation, both in the charrettes and the written comments. I think we can all agree that that's going to make this a more robust process. So we appreciate everyone's participation.
Yeah, thank you, and we endeavor to never use the word charrette again.
And with that, thank you, everyone. And that concludes public policy charrette number 3.